London was profoundly a monocultural city. All that's gone. And that, of course, triggered the speech by Enoch Powell and the determination from that point onwards, essentially to suppress debate.
We had these set of British values. They're hugely vague and nebulous, and in some cases they're actually in conflict with one another.
The thing that was under consistent attack in the Blair years was the idea of Englishness.
I take great pride in my Islamic faith, but I'd be the first one to admit that especially more segregated elements of the Muslim population, anti-Semitism is rife. Discrimination against sexual minorities is part and parcel.
We've got to change our politics, we've got to change our charities, we've got to change our values, we've got to change our legal system. Now, Rakib, come on.
No, it's terrible.
What
It's
pipe
terrible.
have you been
It's terrible.
smoking this? What pipe have you been smoking this morning? Yes.
Hello and welcome to David Starkey Talks. I am Dr. Rakib Hassan, and today I'll be talking with the magnificent David Starkey on matters of London, focusing particularly on the decline of a once great city and who is responsible for that decline, delving into matters of urban decay, and then we'll be moving on to admittedly sensitive matters of national identity. So firstly, David, I'd like to ask you, looking at the decline of London, how severe would you describe this decline, and who do you hold responsible for it?
Ooh. Again, I've known right. When did I first come to London? How many decades before you were born? I first stepped into this city. It would have been we couldn't afford to come up to the Great Exhibition of 1951. Nor the coronation of 53. I would first step here as a boy of 11. So I'm in, where am I now? I'm in 1956. There was still willow herb. There were huge areas of the city that were still bombed. There was the filth of smoke everywhere. There was still the remains of the great smokes, the great fogs, which had enveloped the city. It was still subject to, we'd only just escaped real rationing, barely 5 years. Now, in one sense, the London that we have now is inconceivably better. The transformations of building, the cleaning, the restoration, the extraordinary sense of boom, of growth around the city of London itself. So some of it, the state of the shops, what one can buy, the food shops, all of this kind of thing. In other words, what I'm doing is, in one sense, Rakib, I am conceding what is talked about of the success of the post-war society. And to some extent, it is simply unchallengeable. But what have we lost? You see, as always, historical change is a complex process. One gains and one loses. There has been, in so many ways, extraordinary material gain. Equally, of course, and remember, if we go back to that city of the 1950s, there are still huge, profoundly poor slum areas. The docks are hovering on the point of it's the last moment really when the docks show themselves in their old light is Churchill's funeral in the 1960s. There's a whole world which is dying, another one waiting to be born, and so on. But of course, it was an intensely white city, the greatest change I had never seen. Again, and this is also an interesting fact, I do not terribly often, even when they have doctorates, speak to people of a different complexion from mine. I first saw a black person, how many years later, when I went to Cambridge. So we're now in the 1960s. I simply hadn't. I knew, of course, they existed. I knew about the empire, and I had read my Kipling and so on. But it was a profoundly white society. It was much more coherent. there were huge places, there were large patches of lawlessness. This is the world of the craze, this is the world of the gangs, and so on. There was at the same time if I think of my own little town in the north, and I also knew the industrial north, I knew the already decaying world of the cotton towns, which were always satanic mills. It's where the phrase dark satanic mills comes from. I knew all that, but there was intense social discipline. I remember my council estate, because I was born on one, and it was run by women, these extraordinary women. I don't know whether you remember Ina Sharples in EastEnders, there with the huge heaved up bosoms, the turbans, literally exactly that. And any lad, because of course it's 99% of the time, a lad who stepped out of line was cuffed, and cuffed hard, and took it. All of that's gone. We've got something different. We've got London that was in one sense cosmopolitan. There was still an empire. The monarch had ceased to be emperor of India in the 40s, but there was still emphatically an empire. I was taught that between a quarter and a third of the globe still being coloured pink, inexplicably, it always was. There was still an empire, but London too was profoundly a monocultural city. All that's gone. So what we have then is, again, this extraordinary contrast, isn't it, between staggering affluence. If you look at the areas in the article that I've been reading of yours, if you look at the areas where knife crime is most prone, the most flagrant cases of knife crime involving robbery of things like Rolexes, they're the richest areas of London. They're large chunks of Westminster. There are St James's. There's the area around Harrods. There's the area of Knightsbridge. Here, of course, there's a sense of one of the richest cities in the world. The things in the shops are staggering. But of course, there is this extraordinary juxtaposition, isn't there, which is very characteristic of the city, of the very rich and the poor, of the law-abiding and the and the criminal, all turfed up together and with remarkably little in and between them. Because you see, what has happened to us, I think, and so I'm not pointing particular blame at individuals. What I'm saying is we were a very different kind of society. If you are homogenous, if there are powerful social restraints, in other words, people restrain themselves or groups restrain them, if there's a powerful sense of a history of self-governance. Remember, why don't we have an armed police force? Why don't we have an armed police force?
I think ultimately we have that classic model of policing by consent.
Yes, but why do we, but sorry, Rakib, why do we have that model?
Well, I think that ultimately, firstly, many police officers supported that model largely because I'd consider to be, back in the day, we were a higher trust, civilized
We were a
society.
high, but it's so this term higher trust is a modern invention. Why? Who is right? Forgive me interrogating, but it's really interesting that somebody as informed and as active in this area isn't giving me instant answers. Why? Who invents policing by consent? Who actually introduces the very idea of the citizen policeman? Why do our police not look like the army, though are increasingly doing so? Why traditionally did they wear a funny helmet? Why were they called constables?
Well, I think that we have that policing by consent. There's that Peel-like model.
It's Peel, right? It's Sir Robert Peel. It's the 1830s. In other words, this is, remember, one of the great moments of reform, parliamentary reform, and the whole basis of that idea of Parliament was self-government. That Parliament was just the pinnacle of a whole structure of what one of the great authorities, one of those who's written most movingly about all of this, that's to say Edmund Burke, talks about the little platoons, that world in which I describe my little estate in the north of England, where social pressure said you don't throw litter. You were taught it aggressively at school, and if you didn't cut your privet hedge and didn't cut your lawn, the groups of neighbours would come up and complain. There was one criminal family on the estate, very mild criminality, I can still remember their name, Capstick, and they were socially shunned. Now, in other words, there was an intense mechanism of self-government at every level. Now, unfortunately, many things have happened to disturb that. You've introduced groups into society who do not respect that. They have traditions of their own, but they are wildly, wildly different. This idea that all people, as it were, are suitable for self-determination is a silly one, because unless you practice self-government, it doesn't work, which is why there are so many failed states. Again, it's also very clear that in one sense, diversity is a profound weakness. Can you in other words, simply slide from that society where there's this intense, I'm going to use the word, and it's a sort of racial word, and indeed in American universities it's essentially banned, an Anglo-Saxon notion of self-government, which you won't find in continental Europe either. Continental Europe, you have gendarmerie, you have military police, you have a tradition of rioting. All of these things. And isn't the answer, to cut all this short, isn't the answer that we slithered from the society of the 1950s and the early 1960s to the society of the 2020s, simply thinking in very British fashion we could get away with it? Isn't that the truth? And we've now discovered we can't get away with it.
I think that the only thing that if I slightly push back is that we have seen various forms of social breakdown and growing forms of criminality also in parts of the country which are still relatively ethnically and religiously homogenous. So how would you explain for that then, David?
It is perfectly easy to see why similar things have happened in areas that remain relatively homogenous. That's to say that the structures of the welfare state, the enormously developed bureaucracies of the welfare state, have transformed completely that pattern of self-government and have destroyed it. When I was a young man, there was still a chap who came round to the door to collect for a little insurance policy. Everybody had their insurance policy. Do you know what? Largely to pay for death benefit, largely to pay for their funerals. There were clubs that you put money into to pay for a little bit of better food at Christmas. There was still an intensely developed trade union movement that wasn't just in nationalized industries, campaigning to give drivers already on 60,000 a year for doing very little to pay them 80,000 for doing even less. You had instead, my father was a very active trade unionist as well as a very active member for a period of time of the Labour Party. But all of that represented another form of self-government, all of which has gone. All of those things have been suppressed by the activities of the welfare state. The whole origin of the welfare state in the 1940s deliberately suppressed small-scale charity. It was the intention. The idea was that we shouldn't depend on charity. That was demeaning, that it was better to have state-funded welfare. But of course, that leads and once the economy, the various forms of industrial activity, steelworking, cotton, shipbuilding, coal mining, once they disappear, once the industrial structures that supported them disappear, as they do, of course, once the local economy collapses and becomes an economy, if you're lucky, of call centres and so on, of course the machineries of social control go. But let's just keep on London, because I think that's the important one. So what we did, we sort of slithered into the present mess that we are in now, in a very, very British fashion. And the only moment that there was any real attempt at thinking about it seriously, well, there were two really. There was the response to the first tensions that came about from, as it were, import of significant numbers of different people. So, I mean, essentially, to begin with, the so-called Windrush generation, and that, of course, triggered the speech by Enoch Powell and the determination from that point onwards, which I would regard as one of the absolute fundamental errors, essentially to suppress debate. Because is not that the effect of the state's general response with the first Race Relations Act, the destruction of Powell's career, and so on? I mean, is that, or would you see, because clearly that's also the beginning of legislation designed to suppress race discrimination, but doesn't it have a double edge that we in the same time we said we want to deter racial discrimination, what we effectively did was to introduce a blanket ban in talking seriously about these things.
I think that certainly we've seen various forms of cultural change, which, in my view, has added a great deal of censoriousness in terms of having these kind of debates on
But sorry,
sort of
isn't it?
integration and
Forgive me,
identity.
Rakib. Isn't from the beginning that the case? I mean, that one could have challenged Enoch Powell by debate.
Mm.
People have argued, to the back teeth, that some of the evidence that he introduced might have been faked. Much of it was certainly exaggerated. But there wasn't really an attempt at debate, was there? Instead, we said we simply got to silence people. So if again, look at an area in your articles, which is a direct descendant of the problem that we're talking about, which is the question of the extraordinary fact that knife crime is one half a black crime. In other words, if you look at incidents of knife crime in central London, I think I've got my figures right. It's between 40 and 50%. It's black on black, isn't it? And black on white.
Oh, no, absolutely.
The figures are terrifying. Now, let me just give you an illustration. There are key issues of a particular form of culture, the kind of culture of violence, the culture of material excess, which is embedded and embodied in things like particular forms of drill rap and so on. I talked about these directly and openly in the wake of the 2011 riots, and everybody said, "Shut up. You're not allowed to talk about it." Can I remind you that the whole business of drill rap was assiduously promoted by the music channels of the BBC, led by the son of a bishop, a man called Tim Westwood? We have Stormzy, one of those who purveys this stuff, just having been given a doctorate of law at the University of Cambridge, and rewarded by, as it were, by being able to create a pure black scholarship at Cambridge. In other words, we've had a culture of lies, a culture of silence around this. People have, ever since the 60s, there's what has happened in the last year, literally the last year or two, ever since Elon Musk walked into the headquarters of Twitter with his sink. There's been, for the first time in more than half a century, some sort of willingness to talk openly. Careers were ruined by a word out of place, weren't they? There was an attempt at ruining mine, and if I weren't such a tough bugger, it would have been ruined. Is it any wonder, if you can't debate, if you can't talk, if you can't rehearse evidence, is it any wonder?
I remember what happened to you in the aftermath of the 2011 England riots. And I think that there was one part of your analysis which people latched on. Is essentially, but correct me if I'm wrong, but it was suggesting that there were elements of the white working class youth population taking on what you consider to be
Which was
black behaviours.
exactly true.
So
Absolutely true.
people took issue with that. I think the worrying thing there was that instead of actually engaging with the point or challenging you, I do agree that there was a direct attempt to censor you. and ultimately
But it was
living in
true.
career.
But it's true. It's
So
true.
I think this would be an opportune time, maybe flesh that out and actually explain what you meant by that specific point. I think that would really add value to the conversation that we're having
Well,
right
I,
now.
I think I think that the key point is it is quite clear that in many parts of London, and many other of our big cities, as you can tell by the shift of popular accents, that what you yourself describe as a very destructive, intensely materialistic and hyper-masculine, hyper-violent quasi-gang cult has become the dominant culture, including that of the native population. In other words, the white population. It's at its most intense, clearly, but the black gangster serves as a much more general model. And that was what I was trying to say. But once again, it was impossible to say it because ever since going back to Powell, we decided we didn't want to talk about this and we didn't want to raise the serious questions. So, I mean, can we at least agree that part of the problem has been that we did the opposite of what people who are like us and have a background in serious research, an attempt at serious thinking, which is open, reasoned debate. The only the only way you can deal with any of these problems is by open, reasoned debate, and the use of terms like racist or fascist or whatever, simply to silence, is one of the reasons that we're in the catastrophic mess that we're in now. Would we agree with that?
I think we could be in complete agreement with that. And I think that just to build on that point, I think there'll be some people who'd also offer the view. So, in my view, the Black Caribbean experience has actually been a quite depressing one, in my
It's been
opinion. I
dreadful,
think
hasn't it?
it's been dreadful. And I think that, in a way, you look at that relationship between what argues to be quite dysfunctional elements of the white British working classes now and the Black Caribbean population at large. I actually look at it being, it's almost like a symbiotic relationship of destruction in a way. That's the way I'd describe it. And I think that that's why when we have these debates on integration, I think firstly it'd be good to talk about later on what we even mean by integration in this day and age. But it doesn't say a lot that probably the group in my view which is the most culturally assimilated, in my view, are Black Caribbeans. They tend to marry at higher rates into the white British mainstream, admittedly more working class elements of that mainstream. They become also very secularized in terms of withdrawing from their Christian devotion. I think so, certainly when you compare that to many Black African ethnic groups. And I don't think the result of that has been very good. So, in some ways, the argument you made with the 2011 England riots was that there are white working class youths who are adopting these black behaviors. But I also think, in a way, with Black Caribbeans, in a way, they become so hyper integrated into which were, in my view, already quite unstable elements. We're not talking about traditional working class elements of the white British population, but more dysfunctional elements, which were already you are seeing them being almost trapped in this cycle of welfare dependency, which you were talking about earlier on. So I think what we're seeing here is that it's not so much that that process is one-sided, but it's symbiotic in that destruction.
I think
Would you
that's a
say
very
that?
good way. I think that's agreed, an excellent way of putting it. But so if we, it's very good. We're doing again what we should. We're establishing fundamental areas of agreement. If we go forward now, so I said I think that there were two reactions if you remember, I began with the proposition that the fundamental problem was that we slithered in a very, very British fashion. But we did. There were the two things. There was the decision essentially to try to shut people up, which of course has become much more sophisticated, and I imagine at some point we'll go on and talk about its latest very alarming manifestations. But there was a serious attempt, and I think we need to acknowledge its seriousness. I think it was profoundly misconceived, but there was a serious attempt, as there was in most things, in the Blair years, that's from 1997 onwards to 2010, to rethink the whole question of British identity. And it was a serious attempt, as indeed I've argued there was an attempt, and a very successful one, although the consequences, in my view, are terrible, to reinvent the entire British state. What I talk about, the slow burn French Revolution or Blairite Revolution of those years. But let's just look and pull apart a little bit this question of the creation of a British identity. It seems to me that it took one particular, you can see it coming in various stages, but essentially, again, you'll forgive me if I'm a very old and senile man, so you'll forgive me if I chatter about my childhood. When I was a
I enjoy
boy,
it.
and when I was a boy, and I still got my first passport, which I had for that trip abroad when I was an 11-year-old schoolboy, and my parents, in retrospect, must have sacrificed enormously to let me go on that school trip. I am simply a subject of the crown. That's what I am. And in other words, that we had, remember, Britain is not a nation state. This is the most important thing one has to say to people. That I do not remember anybody describing us as British. The only things that were British were horrific nationalised industries. So you had British Gas and you had British Rail, and indeed you still had just the British Empire. But you didn't call yourself British. I mean, I'm always, and still less Briton, when I see the term Britons. I'm reminded of the remark that Disraeli is supposed to have made when some Vulgarian in the House of Commons, made an anti-Semitic remark, and he replied, when your British ancestors were naked and daubed in woad, mine were priests in the temple of Solomon. It's Briton are the kind of people that Julius Caesar met. And what you were British was simply an identity abroad, like the empire. You were English, Scots, Welsh, Irish at home. The first football matches, and still intensely played, between England and Scotland, the first internationals. So there was what I would call always being anybody in the United Kingdom had a hyphenated identity. You were, if you remember, there was already, when I was a boy, when I was a young man, there were the very beginnings of Scottish nationalism. When the Queen was crowned in 53, there was an immense spate of blowing up post boxes in Scotland because, of course, they had the royal cipher E2R. Well, there hadn't been a Queen Elizabeth I of Scotland. So, but Scots who were loyal Unionist Scots had a hyphenated identity, that you were Scottish in terms of your accent, your religion, usually your education and so on, unless you were the very high elite, in which case you'd been to a high English public school. But in terms of your politics and your social alignment and whatever, you were Anglo-Scot. You see what I mean? There was, because what within all that, within those three cultures, there was a very sharp division. You had Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and particularly Scotland, which had all the elements of a typical continental nationalism: national music, the bagpipe; national dress, the kilt; a national poet, Burns. The English don't have those things. Well, we have got Shakespeare, but we don't have a national dress. Well, actually, we do. It's a Savile Row suit, but that's a long and difficult question. So, but what we gave, England supplied the dominant political and social culture. Now, what was determined to happen under and it's Gordon Brown much more than Tony Blair was, that there's an attempt at eradicating all of that. Or eradicating the essential core of that. Devolution, of course, led to an extreme encouragement of Scottishness, Welshness, Irishness, and whatever. Intensely developed with the concessions to nationalism, though, of course, the setting up of the Scottish Parliament at the behest of Donald Dewar was supposedly to kill Scottish nationalism. Of course, as any sensible person knew, it simply provided a theatre for it. But the thing that was under consistent attack in the Blair years was the idea of Englishness. And instead, which had been, the cultural cement of all of that, and instead you tried to substitute for that historic, subtle, culture of self-government, of self-restraint, of irony, of good manners. You tried to substitute a crude, superimposed British identity in which, remember, we were able to find only two British values: tolerance and diversity. Now, that, of course, is a farce, isn't it? It's always been a farce. Isn't it true? I mean, the idea that you can have a nation built around tolerance and
No, it's
diversity
bonkers.
simply it's bonkers. It turns identity simply into a flag of convenience. Anybody can fly it.
And I also think that in some ways, I'd find these values, tolerance and diversity, diametrically opposed to one another in any case. I think that in some ways, our rising diversity, especially religious diversity, has led to various forms of intolerance. I'll give you an example. For example,
By definition,
yeah, yeah, and I
yes.
think that a bit, I'm someone, and I think I'm hoping we can just talk about this later on. I take great pride in my Bengali ancestry and indeed my Islamic faith, but I'd be the first one to admit that especially more segregated elements of the Muslim population, anti-Semitism is rife. Discrimination against sexual minorities is part and parcel, if truth be told. So I think that the real problem we had is that we had these set of British values. They're hugely vague and nebulous, and in some cases they're actually in conflict with one another. You possibly can't. It can't be the basis for a cohesive national society, can it?
No, I mean, but can I just then press you? And I mean, and you set the conversation. I said, putting my hand in the air. You set the conversation going in this direction. I mean, if you are to argue historically, the general thrust would be that indeed highly diverse societies are impossible as democracies, that they are impossible, that they cannot practice that form of unself-conscious self-government, which is the basis. You see, I think this is because when we talk about democracy and whatever, we've become so simple-minded about it. We just think it means going to the ballot box. It doesn't. It's the culmination of, again, what Burke, what Disraeli talk about, the small platoons, the fact that society at every level is essentially self-regulating. So the structures of government by consent, of policing by consent, of losers' consent in elections, they all sit on this very, very complicated social structure, which, as we've seen in the first bit of our conversation, has been to a very significant extent damaged, if not actually destroyed. But at the same time, we now have this increasingly diverse society in which, of course, the policies of multiculturalism, which basically, this is where you don't really do anything, or you could say imperial divide and rule, you simply let groups go ahead with astonishingly little intervention. I mean, if you look in France, for example, I mean, you look at the problems of Islam in France, it is that there you have an aggressively secular state. And whereas in Britain, we had a state which once it decided that it was no longer simply an Anglican oligarchical state, every other religious group was admitted to the same privileges. I mean, I'm going back, my upbringing is, I was giving, in some sense, a completely false view. It wasn't just an ordinary working class upbringing, because my parents were Quaker. They belonged to a very peculiar and remarkably effective, in terms of in terms of the industrial and intellectual history of Britain, called the Society of Friends. And the decision was taken in the course of the 18th and 19th centuries that dissenters should, as they were called, because they didn't subscribe to the Church of England, should be allowed increasingly the same privileges as members of the Church of England. So we stopped persecuting very early. So as an example, we decided that Quakers would be allowed to set up their own schools. Similarly, when the denial of civil rights to Roman Catholics stopped, Roman Catholic schools were set up, Jewish schools were set up. There's effectively there are Muslim schools, and the state system, of course, was as one that was so loose that it deliberately has adjusted to this. So we have this intensely diverse system of education, in which, again, very laissez-faire, rival groups, if they've chosen, have been able to pursue policies of what really amounts to apartheid, which means separate development. That's happened, hasn't it?
Well, I think unfortunately we're moving into that direction. I think in some ways you almost have a kind of, I'd describe it as like an Ottoman style millet system that's almost like sort of
Yes,
taking root.
yes, or in other words, you've got increasingly self-governing
Mm.
communities, or at least in the immigrant population. The problem is there isn't the equivalent of these things in the
No,
white
you don't have white
population.
British community leaders at the end of the day. You don't
We
really have
do,
that
we
kind
do.
of dynamic.
Community leaders invariably mean somebody with a brown skin and a different religion. That, of course, there's a very different sort of community leader. If you look at the Caribbean population, it would have to be a local politician of something of that sort of thing. Now, this is profoundly dangerous because what were the Ottomans? It was an absolute empire. There was no nonsense about democracy. You look again at the highly diverse societies, racially diverse, although they were white, of the Balkans, something like Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia worked rather well when it was run by Tito, when it was run as a communist dictatorship. It was actually rather an enlightened communist dictatorship. The moment you move that hand,
All hell breaks loose. Yeah.
disintegration. Disintegration. So what do we do? I mean, it's perfectly clear. I mean, what are you saying? Are you just admitting that it's failed?
Oh, I think that I
Can
think we're a
you
failing
can you
democracy.
can
Absolutely.
you no, but now educate me. This is your area much more than mine. Bearing in mind, and I'm being very serious, bearing in mind the mess that we're in now, that these things have happened. What can we do, if anything? Because let me just first put my cards on the table. I think some situations cannot be mended. I think that there are irreparable problems. So my essential, as it were, my starter would be, I think the mess that we're in now cannot be contained within our existing political structures. Would you argue me out of that position?
I would find it very difficult to argue out of that particular position. And I think the one thing I'd definitely say is, in some cases, I think we are too far gone. I think that that is the truth of it. I think there's things that we can do now, in terms of our current immigration system. I'd want that to be far more rigorously selective. In my view, I think it needs to be focusing on drastically reducing the numbers, and I think that that's the mainstream British position now, in my view. And I think that you have to be prioritizing, in my view, higher skilled migrants, ideally from English speaking democracies, ideally countries within the Anglosphere, democracies with comparable standards of living. I think you could say that that'd be a hugely radical change to what we've
But this
had.
wouldn't it? I mean, Rakib, the problem is that would involve standing the entire current machinery of immigration on its head. It would also, of course, and remember, you're a very unusual voice. You described yourself as a proud Muslim and whatever, but the entire machinery which now supports our current immigration policies, the legal structures, the charitable structures, the structures within the Home Office, are all pursuing exactly the opposite policy, are they not? So, in other words, you're a voice crying in the wilderness.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm a voice crying in the wilderness. I think there's many people who share my opinion. I think this is coming to my next point. I think that if these things aren't sorted out quickly, I'm very concerned about the level of social stability in the country at large. I think that there's a great deal
But
of
sorry again,
disaffection.
forgive me interrupting. And it's not, I'm just trying to pin us down because it's been fascinating, as we're moving from area of mutual agreement to area of mutual agreement. bearing in mind that you have a Labour government now, you look at the people sitting on the back benches. We've already seen that it's a government which cannot perform the most elementary required tasks of state with a majority of 100 and odd. It cannot begin the process of cutting back on welfare because all of these sentimental backbenchers are determined that, removing tuppence halfpenny from somebody is the most wicked thing. Isn't there a similar huge structure in the Labour Party, with, of course, a very much of the Labour vote having been based on deliberate concession to the very unintegrated aspects of Islam, people very different from you. I mean, if you look at the recent photographs, the recent images of Rachel Reeves, draping herself in a headscarf, this whole way in which the Labour Party has prostrated itself before sectarian Islam. So, in other words, there is not, again, let's be honest, there isn't a cat in hell's chance of the change in immigration policy that you're talking about happening, is
Well,
there?
I mean, listen, I think we have to maintain a degree of optimism, but then you also have to be
No, no,
realistic.
but
So,
sorry, I'm
but
asking you. You began,
no,
doctor, by
but
by by by
I
by
think
no, no,
the point to make here is that, in my view, there'd have to be radical change at the national level in terms of our politics. Now, I'm not saying that that would require a majority reform government further down the line. I just think that we're seeing all these problems. I think that there's a real possibility of seeing this kind of political fragmentation. I think that could also impact on, ultimately, the kind of government that we have in the future. They would have to perform a radical overhaul of the civil service. How easy that would be, I'm not entirely sure. That would be very difficult. And you're talking about that charitable structure. We have many in my view, I'd consider them to be open border charities, in my opinion. And
exactly.
you'd have to find a way. That particular government would have to be very courageous in terms of breaking down the relationship, long-standing relationship between the state infrastructure and their connections with those kind of charitable organizations. So you would need radical systems level change. Otherwise, you can't enable that kind of policy. There's no point introducing the policies without making those radical changes to that social and political infrastructures that we currently have in place. They both go hand in hand.
Isn't it still worse? You mentioned the civil service. You mentioned the charities. Things. There's this whole series of things. The most egregious of them is Care for Calais, but the Refugee Council, all paid for with large chunks of taxpayers' money, of course, pursuing policies which are directly opposed to the public interest. But there's a more fundamental point, isn't there, Rakib, which is the law is on their side. This is the problem. The whole of the way human rights law has been perverted to protect exactly the most undesirable
Then
minorities, and
absolutely, I couldn't agree more.
this is the problem. And so can I just remind you of what you said we've got to do? And when I challenge you that you were pie in the sky, we've got to change our politics. We've got to change our charities. We've got to change our values. We've got
Laws,
to change our legal
laws as well.
system.
Yeah.
Now, Rakib, come
No, no,
on.
it's
What
terrible.
what
It's
pipe
terrible.
have
No,
you
no,
been
it's terrible.
smoking
No.
this? What
Listen,
pipe have you been smoking this
listen.
morning?
I'm
Yes.
a real social conservative. I haven't been smoking anything, I assure you. But I think that, David, I'll make this point. I'm really glad you mentioned the Human Rights Act, because within that you have provisions which essentially encourages our judges to make decisions based on the ECHR. Now, by the way, I'd make this point that I wouldn't even blame the ECHR here. Actually, the problem is, for some reason or the other, we have a judiciary which tends to prioritise the interests of foreign citizens over British national
Can
citizens.
I tell you why?
I'd love to hear your explanation.
The explanation is this is intrinsic. The man responsible for this, the man who inspired the legal changes under Blair, is a man called Tom Bingham, who was the last First Law Lord. That's to say, he was the president of the chairman of the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords before it's transformed into the Supreme Court. And he wrote a profoundly dangerous but profoundly influential book on the rule of law, in which he incorporated human rights law and, I'm afraid, international law, hence the whole mess of the Chagos Islands. But he described, and I'm quoting to you now, absolutely word for word what he said in an explanatory lecture. on the nature of human rights law. He said human rights law, by definition, is anti-democratic and counter-majoritarian, and it prioritizes and protects minorities against the majority. And he goes on and he lists those minorities. He lists the mentally sick, Ruda Cabana and Kalokane. He lists the Roma, the outrages of Leeds, as we saw, and the list just goes on endlessly. So, in other words, this is not just, and this is why I'm putting to you the profound. You and I have got essentially, and I'm fascinated by this, exactly the same shopping list of things that need to be done. But what we need to recognize is the unbelievable difficulty of
I
doing
agree with
it,
that.
because the entire structure of the state as it's
Has to be
developed
fundamentally
from,
reorganized. Has to be fundamentally reorganized.
dare I suggest, as we are coming up to the hour, dare I suggest that we actually agree and shake hands. I can't believe this. Shake hands on the fact that we need a great repeal and restoration. We need that great undoing of what the Blair years did, and as far as possible, a going back to that world that I was brought up in, where we still believed, oddly enough, that we were free. We boasted about being still a free-born Englishman. And we were confident of one thing, and one thing that I think, I'm certain now, is the underpinning of what both you and I have been talking about, which is the absolute belief in one simple form of equality, not an Equalities Act, but a simple, straightforward equality before the law. Until we go back to that, we're lost.
I completely agree. I think we can both agree there needs to be a fundamental reorganization of what you would consider to be the Blairite state.
The Constitution,
Yeah,
yeah.
and I think that ultimately, when you look at the Human Rights Act, clearly not fit for purpose. I think that when you talk about even the Equality Act, that I have to say, when that was passed, I was 20 years of age. I support that. I support that at the
Of course,
time. But I think what's very clear here is that that has been used as an instrument of positive discrimination, in my opinion,
totally.
and in my view, in some ways, it has almost it has been attempted by the sort of DEI brigade to use as some kind of sword to discriminate, well, quite often against white middle-aged men. I think that would be my view. So I think ultimately what I'd have to say is that I'm a little bit more optimistic than you. I'd like to think that I haven't got my head in the clouds. I think that it's achievable, but you're absolutely right. We're talking about a radical overhaul of our political system, our current laws, how the state is configured and how it's connected to the charitable sector, for example. But I do think that with the government, which has its heart in the right place, it has the intellectual resources, and it has that passion, and it has that political will, that is achievable. I maintain that optimism.
When have we had a government like that?
Oh, it's been a very, very long time. It's been a very long time.
Shall we just end on that long sigh? It's a very long time ago.
And I'll,
That was
no,
wonderful.
thank you so much for having me, David. And I hope you enjoyed my questions as well.
I've been delighted, and I think the really important thing is doing as we've tried to do from our wildly different backgrounds and everything else, to work forward to common agreed positions on a basis of debate, sense, good humour, evidence. And that is the only possible way in which we can begin to rescue this mess, plus a bit of passion and a bit of optimism like you.
No, I couldn't agree more. I really enjoyed the conversation. It was a pleasure being part of it.